Mr. Chaworth grew more and more upright in his chair as he turned the page of the letter that he was reading, and Mrs. Chaworth knew that unless he found something agreeable on this new page, his right hand would go up to clutch his wig, his left thump the letter under the table, and he would cry, "Lard, lard, lard, Mrs. Chaworth." It was very thoughtless of Jack. He knew that Mr. Chaworth was easily vexed in the morning. But perhaps Jack thought that he was no longer subject to reproof, having been away from home. She peered round the pie at her younger cousin, who, with his head barbarously near the cloth and his rapidly growing form bulging from his blue midshipman's coat, was now engaged in making a storm in his teacup by blowing. Jack Byron and his sister were cousins of the Chaworths, but they'd lived at Medmenham from their youngest days, ever since Lady Byron had died, and they were entirely part of the household. Even now that Jack's elder brother, the present Lord Byron, was living at Newstead Abbey again, there was no question of their going back there. "Lard, lard, lard, Mrs. Chaworth," cried the master of the house, grasping his wig. She automatically put out her hand to steady the tea-urn, which was apt to fall over, parboiling her knees. But the expected thump didn't come. Mr. Chaworth arrested his descending hand and pointed its index finger at Jack. "What the devil do you think you're doing?" he exclaimed. But his words were prompted less by a spirit of inquiry than by a momentary urge to be disagreeable, and without waiting for an answer he went on, "If these are naval manners, manners, forsooth, they were best kept for sea." "What is it, my dear?" asked Mrs. Chaworth, waving a lace handkerchief by way of distracting his attention from Jack, whom she loved dearly. "The stream!" cried Mr. Chaworth. "The stream! He's going to turn the stream into his top-field to make an enormous, vast, loathsome fountain for his wedding day." "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Chaworth, who had expected something very much more shocking than this, "I'm sure Mr. Elwes will turn it back again afterwards, when he's married." "And what do you suppose the trout will do in the meantime?" cried Mr. Chaworth, with all the agony of a devoted fisherman. "What do you suppose will happen to the trouts, Mrs. Chaworth?" Mrs. Chaworth really didn't mind. She never fished, or hunted, or shot, and she secretly disliked all these creatures that were so laboriously pursued. If it were not for them, the family would spend most of the year in London, a much more agreeable kind of life. However, she didn't say this, but soothingly replied, "But in that case, surely it would be much easier to take them up, my dear. You could use a little net in the puddles that are left." Mr. Chaworth uttered a desolate howl, but made no further reply. In 20 years of an otherwise happy marriage, he had never been able to make his wife understand the sanctity of game. But now, rather than persist in the hopeless task, he seized upon the ham and silently carved it, with as much ferocity as if Mr. Elwes had been under his knife. It cannot be denied that Mr. Elwes was a troublesome neighbour. His eccentricity was the delight of the countryside. Yet it's one thing to have an amusing eccentric 2 or 3 parishes away, and quite another to have him as your next-door neighbour. The person in classical mythology who fitted his guests to the bed in his spare room by means of an axe or a rack was a source of endless gossip and diversion to the neighbourhood in general, but he must have been a sad bore to those who lived within the range of his victims' cries. Mr. Elwes, then, was a troublesome neighbour, and this menace to the stream was but the latest of a series of outrages. He lived at Plashy, whose venerable roof could be seen from the terrace at Medmenham in the winter when the leaves were off the trees. Plashy was the other big house in the parish, and it was much older than Medmenham. Its most recent parts were Tudor, and the kitchens were Saxon. It was built facing north, in the bottom of a watery dell. Mr. Elwes, however, hadn't inherited Plashy. He'd only bought it. And although he'd lived there some 20 years, he was still considered a newcomer. For most of these years, that's to say until he took up politics, he had lived a retired, secluded existence, with a household consisting of no more than a few vague, shiftless servants, and a boy, Tobias Barrow, who was usually called his nephew. Jack Byron and Tobias Barrow were very close friends. Their friendship dated from long ago, when there'd still been a fair amount of visiting and acquaintance between Medmenham and Plashy, and as soon as breakfast was over, Jack hurried away to find Tobias. He knew that Mr. Elwes was capable of any villainy, but he also knew that rumour delighted in exaggeration. Mr. Elwes' ape, at its first arrival, had been confidently reported as the devil in person, and he hoped to learn that this appalling news was ill-founded. He crossed the bowling green, hurried through the kitchen garden into the park, and along his private path towards the outer paling. During his absence at sea, the path had almost vanished in the grass, but he knew it so well that he could follow it at midnight without a moon. He came to the pollard hornbeam that had always served as his ladder to get out of the park. There were rounded knobs on its gnarled old trunk that allowed one to reach the pointed ends of the pales, there to poise for the downward leap over the ditch and onto the soft bank that ran along the side of the lane below, the lane that separated Plashy's land from Medmenham's. Jack and his nearest cousin Georgiana had used this route from their most tender infancy. In those days the ascent of the tree had been a matter of tears, blood, barked shins, and childish oaths. But now Jack swung up it with the ease of one to whom the main-t'gallant masthead of a man-of-war is as easy and familiar as a pulpit to a parson. And he was just about to spring down when he saw Mr. Elwes in the meadow over the way, gathering simples in a sky-blue coat and scarlet breeches. He was a man past the middle age, with a large, yellow-grey face. He had a very great deal of energy, and as he sprang about the field he sang odd snatches, gesticulated, and harangued the yak that stood in the far corner. Jack shrank back into the leaves. Mr. Elwes picked Dittender, middle confound, and stinking arrock. He picked nigwort, figwort, and lyrican fancy, adding thereto polypody of the oak, pellitory of Spain, and herb truelove. And he offered a blade of the last to the yak as it stood panting in the shade of the ragged hedge. This monolithic beast had been imported by Mr. Elwes at vast expense, under the impression that it was the aurochs of antiquity. It was supposed to improve the local breed of cattle out of all recognition, but it did nothing but lurk in the shade, gasping, and it was evident that the race of Nottinghamshire aurochs would soon die out. This was not the case with all his importations, however, and it was almost impossible to keep servants at Plashy because of the salamanders. Salamanders in the libraries, salamanders that had to be rescued from the ashes of the drawing-room grate, the gentle plop of salamanders falling from stair to stair as they tried to mount to the attic, to hibernate in the servants' beds, but above all, salamanders multiplying in their thousands in the cellars that were Mr. Elwes' pride and joy. It was not as cellars that they delighted him, because he drank no wine, but as Saxon relics. He was a virtuoso, for whom anything old was better than anything new. Anything to do with the arts, that is to say, for in other respects he was wonderfully advanced, and he farmed his land upon the newest philosophical principles, designed great schemes for the improvement of mankind, and had invented several machines, including a musical treadmill and a hydraulic rack. But it was in the matter of education that his theories and his energy appeared in their brightest light. "You have no conception," he said to one of his learned friends, "you have no conception of the amount that an infant mind